Here's the start of another rear axle carrier panel repair and reinforcement process on a BMW E46 M3 Coupe. This model was a 2003 with 84,000 miles, and it's in with us at Redish Motorsport for the repair and reinforcement process of the rear axle panel. Got a normal hairline crack next to the left rear subframe mount, which has been there for a while because it's got some corrosion in it. We haven't cleaned the panel yet, but we can clearly see that there's a crack there. There's also a couple of spot welds which have broken up on the side panel, shown by quite a lot of corrosion in that spot weld. And there's another spot weld up there which is also broken, and it may well be presenting a small crack in the seam sealer on the left side panel, which would show rear axle carrier panel movement away from the other panels. We've also got a crack on the right front mount, but it's again hard to see whilst we've got the axle built up. This is just an introduction to the repair. We've already carried out a borescope camera inspection of the cavities from inside the car. The cavity in here underneath the boot floor, and the cavity underneath the rear seat panel, which is where the front subframe bolts go into. Both of those have crack and spot weld issues, so we're also going to be having to take more of the interior apart, protect the inside, and carry out welding work to repair the spot welds and the cracks found inside the car. So we're going to start stripping down the car underneath, getting that ready for the degreased process, and we'll also at the same time be stripping the inside of the car, preparing for the cavity work inside. So we know this M3 already had internal front cavity MIG weld problems. In the front cavity here, underneath that hole that we've created and that one there, we've used a borescope camera to inspect, see what's going on. And also we're going to have to be welding and cutting and grinding and painting inside the car, so we've gone and done the extended internal strip down, rear door cards, seats, everything off. So that's just the strip down. We still need to carry on and protect the car because we obviously got glass installed that we can't remove, and certain things that just don't or can't come out in the time plan that we've got. So everything else has to be protected. That's what it looks like from inside the boot. All the modules away. We'll take these wiring looms out and bring back through later on once we've got the car into its final position and we can disconnect the battery once and for all. This car's already got some audio dynamat in place, which is going to make it a little bit more challenging for us to do our work, because we're going to have to be doing our cut line directly behind or in the crease of that boot floor front section where the dynamat is. So we are going to have to remove some of that stuff. It's quite tricky to remove, but we're going to need to do that to gain access to the rear cavity, where we've also got some small issues in there as well. Here's the underside of the M3 now the axle has been removed. We still need to start taking more fuel tank items off and degreasing the panel, find out where the cracks stop, end, and the hairline issues in the spot welds. One brake pipe survived, these copper ones, although you could say that it's quite nastily made. It's got quite tight, nearly creases on it, where it doubles back on itself, that left flexi hose. The right hand side one didn't survive, had to be cut because the union was corroded internally and just started twisting the copper, and couldn't be freed off however much we tried. So that one will have to be made a new one over the axle, but there is a join already there. Like I say, you might want to consider that one as well because of the sharp sort of nature to those bends. Several brackets suffering with a fair amount of corrosion, is safe to say. Not just surface, there's quite structural on those. They are only mounts for the fuel tank, but they are still quite deep corrosion in them, and over some of the other mounting points. Also various plastic fixings that have exploded due to the corrosion on these studs. That is meant to be a stud for screwing on a self-tapping fixing, so they'll have to be cut off and new riv studs put in place. There's an example of what is a 10mm plastic nut, but even the plastic nut has not survived. Same with that one there, so all these will need to be renewed because they won't go back on. So 3 new studs there definitely, possibly some studs for the brake pipe points because there's not one on there because of corrosion. That one's broken off. and somewhere else I store. Yeah, these are what the studs are meant to look like, just normal 4.8mm self-tapping studs, part of the chassis. But in various locations, the corrosion that had grabbed the metal nut and metal stud just simply wouldn't remove it. So in that position, we'll also need to put a riv stud as well. Fuel system and the breather pipes are now removed, and we can see before we start degreasing that we've got a semicircle crack going around the mounting point there, a spot weld breakage and possibly a crack where the bush has been imprinting its black markings. Possible spot weld breakage, or certainly a lot of flex on those two, if not. A little bit of a crack identification in a corrosion mark around that section. Definite crack there, possibly a blown spot weld up there, and then our common spot weld breakages on the side panel, maybe a move in there as well. And now we could probably see the crack in the seat, or the split in the seam sealer, to suggest that the panel's been moving slightly away from the wheel arch panel. So next stage is to degrease the entire panel underneath and start identifying the cracks. Here's an example of one of the subframe bushes. There's 4 of these in total. Here's the old one that was taken out. This is the front right mount, which is just, well, the actual rubber is broken apart, just crumbling, easy to pull apart, where the aluminium of the shell of the outer bush and the inner sleeve is oxidized because it's bare aluminium, and that pushes the rubber, which was liquid when it was first made, this bush, it pushes it away and then just crumbles and separates. And in certain areas, these 2 pieces here that I've just ripped off, these are the only points of contact for the rubber bush to touch the rear axle carrier panel. The sleeve is bolted solidly, but the top of the bush only has these concentrated lips, which are the point of contact for the front rubber bushes, which is normally why they blow apart and rip off like that, because they've taken a serious amount of loading and unloading during their life. And here's an example of one of the genuine BMW new rubber bushes, which is ready to be installed now that we've removed those old subframe bushes. We finished the degrease of the rear axle carrier panel and the boot floor, the wheel arches and rear trailing arm pockets, and into the seat panel, the areas that we're going to be working and later on blending our paint into, so that first of all we can identify the cracks properly and not miss anything, but secondly that later on processes of paint and protection adhere to things and don't stick to mud, for instance, like that, or grease or oil or wax, things like that. So left front mounting point, definitely got signs of a hairline crack going around the middle of that mounting point, plus a spot weld flex there. A crack coming out of that spot weld going across that way with a hairline around there, a couple of badly flexed, possibly even a broken one there, spot welds that is. Right rear, always hard to find this one, so we've applied a little bit of heat and we've got a crack appearing just in the corner, so we need to deal with that and check on these spot welds, see whether they are just flex and corrosion or whether they are broken underneath. This side, the left rear, we've got the typical crack here, which actually opened up. There's quite a gap in that one now, and it's corroded, plus spot welds, POR, a couple of spot welds broken there. You can see the crack or the split in the seam sealer where the panel is separated from the wheel arch panel very slightly. At the moment, take note that there's no obvious breakages of spot welds up in this area. We'll clean this off. I already know that this panel is moving very slightly by these splits in the sealer and from looking inside the car, but you'll be amazed to see when I take the seam sealer off around, there's 5 spot welds going down here. You'll be interested to see how easy they are to miss when there's broken. I know there's at least 2 broken spot welds down that line, and shortly you'll see where the problems are. And now we've degreased the panel, we can also check for the corrosion that these cars suffer with underneath. Most of the time it's just surface corrosion and there's no problems to carry on with certain things, and then sometimes they're quite heavy corrosion on panels that aren't easily changeable, or even brackets aren't purchasable. You can't buy these fuel tank bracket, for example, nor the brake pipe bracket. They only come on a new rear axle carrier panel, but that's nearly £850 at the moment, so nobody's going to buy those just for the brackets. So on this car here, we've got corrosion on both brackets for the fuel tank and brake pipe both sides, especially the right hand side is quite heavy, but also we've got it behind the bracket where you can't actually get any tools in because it's a closed little cavity in there. We've got some strong corrosion which is quite thick and flaking on the rear axle carrier panel next to the right rear mount. It doesn't look structural and it doesn't seem to have gone through yet, but that's where the fuel tank has been clamped or touching, and where one of the rubber buffers is missed in or moved, and the plastic tank has been rubbing on the metal floor, which has allowed the paint to come off and then corrosion to set in. A decent bit of corrosion then carrying on around that section around there. A little bit affected directly by the rear axle carrier panel flex and the cracks there. This is the handbrake carrier console and where the push rod bolts up. Got corrosion all down the side and quite deep on the edges of that piece. Here's the back of the fuel tank bracket on the left. Rear trailing arm pockets are averagely corroded. These are very hard to clean up, especially to a standard which is not going to return, because they're the angle of where you have to get the tools and certain things inside is quite hard to get to. There's also a little bit of flex here in the sealer which people are starting to notice, where these little pockets, as we call them, for the rear trailing arm are spot welded, with about 10 spot welds to the front of the rear axle carrier panel, where they're obviously just starting to flex. I think that's the same both sides. Still corrosion on this side, a little bit of movement in the sealer there, but still relatively in its original position. These are the spring perches. Sometimes you get a sealer where the spring perch is joined to the rear axle carrier panel, but in this occasion just got it on the nipple, you might call that, which is what locates the spring. Then we've got a little bit deep corrosion on the vertical face of the rear axle carrier panel. This is directly due to flex of the internal cavity section, which is behind this panel, which is what all this line of spot welds is here, and there's a line of spot welds going across here. It's basically a box section, for a better word, where the threaded receivers are welded in, and when they're moving and flexing, loading and unloading all through their life, they break the paint, or the electrophoretic paint, which is this E-coat colour, and that then allows moisture to be on bare metal, and then the corrosion starts. So a little bit on that left rear mount, a little bit on the right rear mount here, but also we get corrosion that affects threaded studs. There's various amounts of these studs throughout the car underneath, which are part of the rear axle carrier panel. That's what they're meant to look like, which is where brake pipe bracket, normally plastic or sometimes metal fixings, get screwed onto to hold the brake pipes or fuel pipes or carbon canister vapor pipes, and these ones have had so much corrosion that there is nothing left, no thread at all, and it's probably half the size thickness that it used to be. Another one there, and then also another one there. Nothing is going to screw back on, so certain studs will also have to be replaced. This one as well, broken off, snapped clean off because of corrosion grab on the tiny small metal clip or nut holding the plastic carbon canister cover on, and you can heat it gently, but it's plastic, so usually the carbon canister cover starts melting, which you can't do. So in some cases it's easier just to admit defeat, have it snap off on you, and then put a riv stud in this location to replace it. Lots of people don't actually put replacement studs in. Actually, I don't think I've seen it being done yet, apart from us. It's normally self-tapper screws that people put up into the panel, or they just leave them, or they bond them on, things like that, whereas we want to make sure that this will never have to be revisited again. This car's having this work done once, and once only in its lifetime. And then moving on to the last bit of corrosion, which isn't actually on the panel that we're dealing with. This is the battery box, away from the rear axle carrier panel. But we're seeing more of these brackets, which are totally useless on the M3. They're only needed for the non-M3 versions, where the carbon canister bolts into these two threaded studs. There's an argument to say that it might strengthen the battery box slightly, but it is a massive corrosion trap, because it's just a hollow little, it's not even a cavity, but it's a hollow section where water, salts and all sorts of atmosphere can sit behind. It's never waxed from the factory, so it just corrodes like mad, and traps loads of rust, which can go two ways. It can obviously come out this way, it can spread, and then it can also go through the battery box, We've only seen one which is hold the battery box, but at the end of the day you don't really want to be having to change a battery box when the car is only sort of 12, 13 years old just because of a corroded bracket. So we advise people to take these off. It's not part of our job because we're working on the 4 mounting points over here, but we love to give a good finish, which means excellent paint protection systems, seam sealer systems, and it's not much issue or much more work for us to actually paint the overlapping panel, so the boot floor panel, a bit into the wheel arch panel, a little bit into the seat panel. We're quite happy to do that whilst we've got the paint and the seam sealers here for your car, but things like excessive corrosion removal and labour times to remove this corrosion are things that just simply can't be covered within the repair. So if there are some things that you'd like us to consider corrosion wise, then let us know and we can give you some idea of prices to remove that sort of thing. Last area of corrosion I forgot to mention is up in the wheel arch panel. These are the the shock absorber top mount turret area, where the shock absorber top mount enters the cabin. These also get corrosion on both sides from memory, and it can creep under the seam sealer. So it's just a good time to consider corrosion removal whilst it's in this state, because it's very rarely that the car is ever going to be stripped down to that state again. So it's something to consider. So at this stage it's really tempting to just get straight on with the wire wheel process, removing the seam sealer, removing the corrosion from underneath the car and inside the car, but what that does is create a massive amount of dust and debris everywhere. So we have to protect the cars. Every car gets one of these. They're disposable, genuine BMW body shop car covers. Every car gets one that gets thrown away, but we tailor it to the car. So some cars are coupe, some cars are convertible. This is a coupe, for instance. Obviously we put the car cover on now, but it's going to blow about, which we can't have. We need it fairly taut on the car's bodywork, so it's protected and not blowing. But also we need to create access holes and openings so that we can get into the car through the door systems on the side of the left of the car and into the boot system. So now we're going to adapt this disposable car cover and tape up all the perimeters so that the car is protected as best as possible before we start the next process. Here's the protection tailored to the vehicle. It doesn't look a great amount, but it's roughly 2.5 hours in the cutting, the profiling, the taping of all the lines. This not only stops the dust, particles, grinding, paint and things like that, but it's meaning we can keep the car in this state for the entire time it's being worked on, and when we come to the paint side of things we don't have to continuously keep prepping even more mask line. This is it. This is like the total mask that we will keep with the vehicle. So the doors are what we call bagged up. We have an access window here which we get taped once we're actually carrying out the final paint process stage. The seats themselves have got BMW car seat covers on, then BMW body shop parts covers. They're all brand new and these all get thrown away after every car. The steering wheel is double wrapped, the center console is removed, the armrest is wrapped, the gear stick and the gear knob are wrapped, the other door is protected there. The glass has cardboard templates that we use for the rear glass panel and the side panels, and then we've got additional the car cover. This is the same cover, so we utilize it and bring it through the boot, underneath the parcel shelf, and then back up to the headlining area. Again, we've got another access that side, weld and fireproof blanket tucked under the carpet, and step-in footwells so that we're not marking any carpets nor causing any damage in the future. We go around to the other side. So we can work in this rear bumper off. The very small aperture trim that's left, the painted finish trim, is triple taped to be honest. For the high traffic areas or any points that the bag could try to split from is taped so that it doesn't rub through or cause any gaps later on. And we can easily work now in the boot. We've got the looms pulled back through both sides, nothing's left in the floor section, so we can cut and grind and carry out extensive work without causing any damage to the car's internal components or the inside of the car. We've got the apertures protected where we're stepping in and stepping out, and then we can work on the front section as well, on the rear seat area. And that is it. That's about 2.5 hours of prep work just to get the bare car protected like that, and now we can go forward and create as much dust as sparks as we want. Now the car's all protected inside and out, we can start removing seam sealer. I've already removed the sound deadening pad on top of this rear axle carrier panel, and also the sealer line that was closing the rectangle join. So we now need to move all the seam sealer off down the side of the seat panel, and also the remnants of what we scraped off with the sound deadening pad. And also down into the boot floor panel, because we're going to have to take that front edge of that boot floor panel off to access the spot weld failure underneath that cavity. And interestingly, we've got a broken spot weld. I haven't yet levered anything with a screwdriver. I haven't touched or drilled out any of these in any fashion. You can still see it's sealed here where this seam sealer was used with a scraper that way. So we haven't touched this panel. And there's one spot weld, really hard to see, but the circular spot weld is in front of my blue glove, and it's got a crack going out to the edge of the panel that way, and also a crack going in towards the panel this way, probably only about 3mm that way and about 4mm that way, because the spot weld is 6mm wide. But it gives you an idea of the flex that we're slightly seeing, and a very, very slight drop. It's so small it's not really worth mentioning, but we're here so we'll video it. This is the rear axle carrier panel, and this is the chassis leg flange. Spot weld, spot weld, spot weld, and it's held to this chassis leg. And if you keep an eye on the join over here where the sealer is sort of filled up the void, as you move slightly across to this corner join, you can see a gap opening up just here. There's like a black shadow under the flange. 1.2mm thick this is, the chassis leg flange, and it's very slightly started to drop, which is also in the same corner as that broken spot weld in the middle of the screen now. We're finding some movement on spot welds on the seat panel. Here's the rear seat panel where it laps onto the mid chassis legs and then over onto the rear axle carrier panel up here. There's a few spot welds, 1, 2, 3, 4 at least on this slope holding it down. And we've got one here which is showing, it's probably not cracked all the way around, but it's definitely got flex or some form of crack around it because there's corrosion in it, and this was covered in thick seam sealer. This spot weld was fine. This one's the original shape, and you can see I've just uncovered some rust colour corrosion, and it's swiped through and stained very slightly the seam sealer over here and here where the corrosion's just been brushed through it, and that tells me that there's a crack around there, and moisture within the cavity behind the seat panel has been allowed to get into the crack in the panel and cause that corrosion colour. So that tells us that that spot weld is starting to break. And I got the exactly the same on the other side of the panel. This spot weld's good, this one's good and totally uncovered. Here's an example of a spot weld which I've just started taking the seam sealer off, and this greeny colour is the E-coat, and that paint is unmarked around the circumference of the spot weld. Whereas when you come to this one, already I've got a trace of corrosion, and this is a thick seam sealer, so the only way corrosion is in there is coming from behind, and if it comes from behind it's normally because of a crack around the spot weld. So it looks like we've definitely got 2 spot weld cracks on the seat panel, as well as the movement within the rear axle carrier panel up on the corner section. Here we are in the boot of the car, just preparing the front section of the boot floor. The boot floor ends just across that line there where it meets, and the spot weld is to the rear axle carrier panel. It's actually got quite a lot of responsibility. There's only a 0.75 fairly flimsy piece of sheet steel which stamped into a shape for strength, but it's actually got the responsibility of holding up the rear axle carrier panel on the inner rectangle on the rearmost line. And we found a spot weld broken in the boot floor corner panel, so it already started very slightly moving into another panel, not enough to actually worry about drastically, but it was caught in plenty of time before it started going into past that ridge line and then causing a crease which takes a long time to come in. So don't get me wrong, that's a long way away, but anyway, I'm getting off the subject. The reason why I'm showing this is because I've drilled out the roughly 10 spot welds across the front of that boot panel. I've carefully removed the 2 MIG welds down either side of the boot panel, and I've made an incision cut all the way across the front near enough the crease all the way to the edge so that we can remove that front section. The only other way of doing it is removing the entire boot panel, which goes all the way to this joint here on the rear panel and all the way down the chassis legs, and nobody's going to want that sort of labour involved. So we make an incision cut here, remove that top cover, and you'll see what's inside next when we come back to the video. We've checked and the panel's ready to move without any force at all, so there it is. And now we access the cavity, the internal rear cavities that are so infamous with wondering what's going on inside. And why we need to get in there is in this, we call it a box section, I suppose, because this specifically, this section over here and this over here are very square right angles, look like a box, or rectangle hollow tube. So we call that section there, or nickname it, a box section. And underneath those stamped T pieces is where the threaded receivers are. And a threaded receiver is something where the subframe bolts go into. And the reason why we had to do all this work to get into this hidden cavity section is because of this little spot weld here, such a tiny small defect. There's one here, for example, which is okay. This one's all lovely, and this one has got a crack all the way around it. I don't think it's gone all the way to the panel edge. It's really close, but that does mean that this ribbed section, which goes towards the front cavity mounts, is detached from this box section or cavity cover. It's got loads of different nicknames. I know it's really confusing. Different people call it different things. And the other issue of a spot weld breakage is down here. At the moment it doesn't look too bad. It's fairly local around the spot weld. There's possibility of a slight crack going that way, but it might just be a weld ball. Sometimes we see cracks going up here, and that's exactly what we're here to prevent. We're here to stop this crack or spot weld breakage traveling up this vertical section, and they all do. That is just the fault and failure pattern of this rear axle carrier panel in E46. Sometimes they'll miss this MIG weld, but predominantly the cracks when this panel and box section starts flexing excessively and coming away from the chassis leg up here, it's cracking this panel, and the cracks are rising either to that MIG weld and they don't stop, they carry on going, or sometimes they'll completely miss the MIG weld and just dead end themselves up here. But any sort of crack or spot weld failure needs to be addressed, and that's the reason why we've taken these drastic steps to make access to this cavity and start cleaning up, and we'll show the way that we repair these two problems shortly. Here's the area above the passenger side or left hand side of the car. This is the ISOFIX child seat bracket where that bolts in, and we're occasionally seeing cracks going across there. I think there is a really small, very hard to see one, just a slight curve across there, which I'm sure is the crack. So first done a 2mm stop drill hole, which is this either end of the crack. Then I've enlarged it because I know there's a panel behind it, which is safe to do. I've enlarged it to an 8mm hole, and I can penetrate now into the cavity panel of the rear axle carrier panel. And I'm going to just see if we can prove the fact that it definitely was a crack by making an incision across this line, which I'm going to carry on cutting through shortly, and making sure that we remove the crack. So what I'm trying to say is, if that is a definite crack, then this section between that crack and the line that I'll put in, the straight line, should just fall out, and it'll be a jagged line to match that crack line, and that will prove that it was a crack all the way through the panel. And that gives us two things. One, we've removed the crack, but secondly, we'll be able to repair and penetrate better than just trying to penetrate onto a hairline crack. We'll actually be able to start in the panel behind and secure that panel to the piece behind it rather than just through the middle of the crack. Well, I'm really pleased with that. That was a crack. As soon as I just went through the panel with my new straight line, this lower line, the piece just moved backwards. I haven't taken it out fully yet, but there it is. So that jagged, well, slightly curved line was a crack, and that attention to detail was definitely worth doing because it was such a small piece, but leaving a crack in a seat panel like that, which is flexing all the time, is just no good. So we can now clean this up. I'll actually move more of it
do another straight line across there. So as long as our straight lines are ending in a radius, i.e. a 2 or 8 mil or 6, whatever people use, then they're not likely to move anymore, and then we can put weld through primer in this and then carry out plug welds here and then continue the channel to fill it up with weld. There, I've carried a line out on the top, and notice we don't join the tops of the spot weld holes together because we don't want anything straight line or any risk of a line continuing. So they're slightly narrower than the circle so that they end in effectively a radius. And now we've got a nice channel where we can clean that up and penetrate our weld into the piece behind, which is the threaded mount of the rear axle carrier panel for the seat belt and the isofix anchorages, and blend the puddle of weld into the seat panel, which is what we're on now. And this gives you an idea of how far away it is. Here's the front mount for the cavity mount. There's some more seatbelt mounts, and there's one of them over there. So really small, really tiny, but worth doing correctly. I've cleaned off the internal cavity, the rear cavity, and this is the reason why we've come into this cavity and cut the boot front of the section of the boot floor open. It's because of this broken spot weld up here, which is becoming increasingly common. Compare it to that one, which is good. This one, which is broken, and also one spot weld broken on this lower edge, holding the cavity cover onto the rear axle carrier panel itself, which is this piece. Extremely small, almost broken straight through the center of the spot weld, and both cracks are going towards this panel edge, and hopefully they would have eventually dead-ended over on the edge of the panel here, but you just never know. Possible signs of a little bit of movement, flex in the center of that spot weld, but no guarantees at all, to be honest. But that one is definitely a crack there. So I'm cleaning a little bit of the wax off because that only burns away when we weld the reinforcement plates later on, and we apply lots of cavity wax after, as you'll see later on in the video. So we can scrape this away now and know that we'll replace it nicely. So rather than just drilling the top layer of the broken spot weld out, we actually go all the way through the rear axle carrier panel and all the way through the cavity cover behind the rib, and then also the rear axle carrier panel behind the cavity cover and the rib. And the reason why we do that is because the Redish V2 plates are designed to go all the way to the top of the rear axle carrier panel, underneath the car obviously, and they come up above these spot welds. So we use that to our advantage and know that at the moment it's hollow. We drill all the way through and it just goes into the outside of the car. But when the Redish V2 plates are on there, there'll be something strong, i.e. a 2mm steel reinforcement plate, for us to start a plug weld on and then puddle it backwards towards this rear axle carrier panel, then the cavity cover, and then the rib. So we're effectively getting rid of the broken spot weld, as well as strengthening the connection between not only these three panels, but also a fourth, which is the Redish V2 plate, which will be on shortly. And the same theory is on this one as well. This was the broken spot weld. We also were able to remove the crack all in one go with this 8mm spot weld drill, because it's oversized, because the traditional factory spot welds are around about 6mm. And our Redish V2 plate goes along this line here. So again, at the moment there's nothing in there. We couldn't weld that now, it just falls straight to the floor. But when the Redish V2 plate's on, we'll start our plug weld on the back of that plate and puddle it upwards into the rear axle carrier panel, then into this cavity cover, effectively doing two jobs at once. And now we'll carry on and do these accessible spot welds as well. Drill that one out and that one out, even though there's nothing wrong with them. Whilst you're here, it'd be mad not to improve the strength and the connection of this cavity cover. We'll drill that rib one out, that one and that one. You see I've center punched them all already, compared to a factory weld which haven't touched yet. Center punch. So 3 more across there, 2 more across the bottom, and we'll also do some on the other side as well. And that'll be our way of removing the issue, but also strengthening the connection as well. Hi Paul, we got the steering tie rods off the car, clamped in a vise now, and we warmed the female side up, and Luke's been unseizing them. So they are coming undone, but that squealing noise tells you how
corroded and seized together they were. Here's the start of the process to identify the cracks and remove them, as well as drill out broken spot welds or just extra flexed spot welds. There's two here that were showing signs of flex, although they weren't broken, so we've taken those out, compare that to that one, and that one, which is perfect. And there's a hairline crack going around that mounting point, so we do what looks excessive, but it's a really good way to do it, an oversized 8mm drill bit rather than using a 2mm, because we know there's a platform behind there, the threaded receiver platform. We can use that to our advantage, not only to create a plug weld there, which also stops the crack, but we're actually going to remove a section. So we know the crack is going around in a slightly jagged, rusty line there, and I've made an incision, very gentle, delicate incision cut here to join the two corners, or corners, but radiuses of the 8mm drill stop drills together, and I've done one down that side as well. And what that does is releases a section of the rear axle carrier panel, and also proves that there was a crack there. Might need a tiny little twist just to get it off at the end, but that removes the crack and also gives us a nice channel now to penetrate our weld overhead into the platform, secures the platform better to the rear axle carrier panel rather than relying on 5 spot welds, and also repairs the crack at the same time. On the other side, I'm just partway doing that. Right in the center here, there's also a lot more signs of spot welds moving or flexing. The only good one was that one there. And here's the one where the bush press is on, and I've purposely stopped halfway through. I haven't gone all the way through yet, because I wanted to show you that you can actually still see the crack in the rear axle carrier panel going diagonally across that way, where the spot weld has been broken by the bush impacting. So I'll carry on now and drill that one deeper to remove this layer of the rear axle carrier panel, and then access the platform behind, which is what this bright metal is over here, you see, and then we can penetrate our weld onto that to start a plug weld. And there's a natural cavity here where there's a stamped part of the platform, and we always do one here. You see there's a gap of I don't know, maybe about 7 or 8mm up there. We do one there because that's where one of the bush imprints, and we actually start a plug weld up there, so it strengthens that part of the panel so that the bush doesn't deform the floor, because the floors can, or the rear axle carrier panel can get dented in this area here. Now we're just removing the sections on the front where the crack is around that semicircle mount. There, it just fell out, and the corrosion behind it shows you that it's been cracked for some time. So we just dig that section out now, and also I've stop drilled the crack on the left rear mount down here and down here from what I can see, and that's really important that they're stop drilled, center punch and stop drilled even before you start scratching or removing the seam sealer or the paint, because as soon as you do, you blur the ends of the cracks, and it's really easy to miss the crack or smudge the crack. This one's, interestingly, is quite open. It's not very hairline anymore. It's actually a gap in there, but so the corrosion is going through that panel, but the crack could be going further than the stop drill that we can see here. But now we've got a good indication of where we think it's finishing. Then we gently remove the seam sealer, and if there is looking like there's a line going out further, then we'll simply do another stop drill as well to be absolutely 100% sure we've dead-ended the crack even before we start any welding work of those cracks. Just starting to disturb the rust and corrosion, chip that off, and just found 2 more cracks on the right rear threaded mount. This is one normally not too bad, not too affected. Very small hairline crack here in the fold, which is a mirrored image of where they crack in the fold on the left hand rear mount. I've also got another one just up here again on another fold of the car, of the rear axle carrier panel. These parts are bare metalled, ready for weld through primer, and this is how important it is to keep your eyes peeled while working on these cars. There is a small crack that I've noticed here coming out of that area of spot weld going that way and stopping about here, so that also needs to be stop drilled or section of metal removed before we go forward and put the weld through primer on there ready for penetrative weld. The other area, this crack has been corroded for so long that, as you saw in the video earlier, it actually opened up, and that metal is very thin, and that's as much corrosion as we dare take out without thinning or damaging the metal. And the stop drills are stopping the crack and dead ending that, and now we can put weld through primer on there, that it's likely to be very tricky to weld, not only because we've got a gap here, but also that the corrosion is not just on the surface of the metal, it's all the way through the metal, and that gap I'm pretty sure is there because corrosion has actually eaten the metal away rather than it moved under its own forces. And the other area on the right rear mount where two cracks were so small, this is why you have to go in with wire wheel gently to remove seam sealer and e-coat rather than a grinder or a flap disc, because now those cracks are effectively smudged and you can only just about make them out in a very slight line. But if those two holes weren't there, you probably wouldn't even notice the cracks, and therefore plating over cracks, which is no good at all. You might just see a faint line going down there, that's the other crack, and that's how small the detail that we're working on. Here's an example of the mounting points just before welding. This is crack and spot welding repair before the reinforcement plates, and this is the silver painter's weld through primer, which is really important because you can still see there's corrosion. These are the troughs in the metal grain where corrosion could be, and you're trying to limit that amount of corrosion before any welding takes place. This is even before the reinforcement plate goes on, so weld through primer essential before the welding happens. I've already welded through primered this mount and welded it, so this is overhead plug welding. That's looking towards the front of the car, nice and flat, not much protrusion, so we know we've got great penetration. We can tell by the look of the weld and also how much or how little is hanging out underneath the car. So we've got two plug welds which replace broken or flexed spot welds, like those ones which are original ones, and those are our two new ones. And this is the channel we created to remove the crack earlier on in the process in the video, and now that is overhead welding to penetrate into the threaded platform behind and then fill up that channel to replace the metal that we took out earlier on. Then once this is cooled down, we need to use a flap disc gently to smooth this down to an absolute flush finish, so that then we can get the reinforcement plate sat tight and bolted in before we start the reinforcement plate welding. We just drilled out a few more spot welds which were suspect. They've extensively flexed, which is what's brought in all this corrosion around them. There's two on this vertical plane, there's another two here, and this one had a crack going through it, so I've taken a section out and given an example of what the edge of the vertical wing looks like in the internal cavity. And there was two under here as well that were looking poor. To be honest, I don't think they had broken completely, but it's better that we replace them with a stronger penetrating plug weld rather than leave them there not knowing if they were cracked, for example. And on the other side we've got the similar things underneath. There's 8 spot welds that hold the lower part of the threaded platform to the rear axle carrier panel, and 5 of them were badly corroded enough to make me think they've been moving and could be cracked, whereas those 3 there look fine. So we're replacing these 5 with plug welds. This is weld through primer that's just gone on to the bare metal, and now we can start the plug weld process. Here's the back of the Redish V2 reinforcement plates, and we've earlier on coated the backs of them with a weld through primer, so that we've still got a nice bare metal, clean metal on the front face where we'll be welding, but the backs of them are nice and protected, so there's no bare metal when it's up against the chassis. So just that, well, that's dried already, just need to give them the dust off, and then they'll be going onto the vehicle once we've finished the crack repair welding process. We're at the stage now where we flatten the MIG welds or plug welds that we carried out earlier on on the underside of the mounting points where we replaced our broken ones, if you remember back earlier on. And then we've gone on to bare metal the chassis with a wire wheel type system in certain places where there's no corrosion or extremely limited corrosion, wire wheel, squeaky clean. And in other areas of high corrosion, let's find an example. Under this mount, we've used a flap disc to actually take a little bit of a calculated risk, I'd say, and thin the metal ever so slightly to try and get as much corrosion out as possible and get the metal grain flat to try and remove all these troughs. But you can still see the colouring, typical rust or corrosion colouring in the area. And the last thing we want to do is trap that with a reinforcement plate. Obviously this and the rear axle carrier panel and the reinforcement plate will have a weld through primer on them, but that's still not enough. So this stage is now going to be a corrosion removal stage. The customer is quite rightly concerned about corrosion on other areas, mainly bolt on, bolt off, well not bolt on, but weld on brackets, a little bit of rear axle panel, and what we saw earlier in the video, handbrake carrier console, and also really quite nasty deep corrosion in this battery box tray. So also, before I forget, rear turrets as well, and spring perch areas. So we're going to carry on and do some additional corrosion removal. This is an additional step and an additional cost to the normal process, and once we've got all this loose corrosion off of these brackets, then we can treat them with POR15 metal prep chemical, not only these brackets but also the mounting points, which should help remove as much corrosion as possible before we go on to the reinforcement plate stage later on. Normally at this stage we'd still concentrate on the mounting points and get them prepared, and also go forward with the welding of the Redish V2 reinforcement plates, which we will do shortly, but I couldn't contain my interest in the rest of the spot welds that are holding the rear axle carrier panel to the other points, and we already know we got some down there which we'll have to fix shortly, but there's also more and more common areas nowadays. And you remember earlier in the video I mentioned that there was two that I think are definitely broken, even though the seam sealer looked absolutely fine. Now here's the row of 5 spot welds that hold it to the rear axle panel to the left chassis leg inside the car, and this one here is part of the seat panel connection, which is going across the front of the car. And we've got one breakage of a spot weld on here, which is not only the spot weld broken, but there's also now a crack in the rear axle carrier panel heading towards the sort of center of the panel. We've also got a very slight crack going through that one that side, one that side. This is the spot weld of a it's a 3 panel connection. It's the rear axle carrier panel, the reinforcement rib, and then the very first corner of the boot floor panel. This is the spot weld that we found inside the car earlier on in the video on the boot floor panel. So there's 2 there on that corner, which is close to the left rear mounting point. And then we've also got one further down the front, which is again a 3-layer panel connection, which is holding the rear axle carrier panel to the internal left chassis leg, and then also holding the seat panel in the corner as well. That spot weld is broken, and again we've got a crack in the rear axle carrier panel and one twisting up this section towards the middle of the panel again. And then on the other side, looks like we've also got a little bit of a breakage around the spot weld, the one that's holding the 3 pieces together, and a little crack trying to go into the rear axle carrier panel. So quite interesting that there's more of these, and it just shows that if you don't take the seam sealer off on spot welds, or have knowledge to remove sealer in hot spot areas, then these sort of things are going to be missed. So on the corrosion removal process and the treatment of the corrosion, we have to not only remove loose corrosion on the rear axle carrier panel, handbrake console, fuel and brake pipe brackets, and the spring perch area and the suspension turrets, but we also deal with the battery tray bracket that's not needed on the M3. They get to such a state where they actually do hold the battery carrier or the battery tray or box, and I think this is one of those occasions where this is likely to hold. This one is unfortunately really corroded, that I couldn't even see the spot welds anymore, and I've had to belt sand through them gently to try and remove it. And this is just an example of how much corrosion is behind this little bracket. I've just used a belt sander to take off the bracket spot weld, but beneath that you can see that there's bright metal on the battery box in the middle, but around the rectangle on the inside is just full of corrosion, which if it isn't eating this way, it's eating into the battery box. And then further down there is a spot weld somewhere around here, but it's so much of the bracket is missing here and here, and it's so just erupted with corrosion that I can't actually see where the spot weld is. I know there was one here which I've removed with a belt sander, but in this area I've not got one, so I need to take quite a section out so that when we delicately move this bracket, nothing's holding on and likely to pull a hole open. So we'll do that next, and we'll see what we're left with underneath that bracket. And the other area which we sometimes have issues with is these fuel tank brackets and the brake pipe brackets. Extremely corroded, not only on the outside face, and that's achievable, you can sort that out, but the inside face of this bracket is extremely hard to get to with any tools, and also the rear axle carrier panel that it's welded to is very hard to get into the areas without damaging this thin corroded metal. So as long as they're structurally sound, which they are, they're just deep surface corrosion, we normally, and we are going to do in this case, drill out the spot welds to remove these brackets from the rear axle carrier panel. Then we can get to the metal of the rear axle carrier panel where these once were, sort that and treat that, repair any issues that we find, and then we can either reuse these brackets, clean them up and weld them back into position by plug welds, or more often than not, and what we're going to do here is put them in. We offer a reconditioning program, which is where we exchange these. We've already got brackets that have come off of other cars, or old panels that we've removed, or cars that we've even bought sometimes to get these sort of brackets spare and give us a stock of them. And as long as they're okay, then we will have them blasted, which is normally media blasting or aqua blasting sometimes, and then we'll treat them with a POR15 metal prep for 30 minutes to neutralize any lasting corrosion. Here's a set here which we've got left, which is ready. They've just been under the infrared lamp after being treated, and these are the ones we're going to put back onto this car. And the majority of corrosion has been removed by blasting techniques, and they are still pitted, but they've been neutralized, or the corrosion has been, and that's what we'll use to put back on in place onto this car. And then this car's brackets will go into our exchange program and be blasted again for the next car that needs a set. So small cost for doing that blasting, because we don't do it on site. We have to send them away to subcontractors, but as most people can understand by these videos and pictures, there's one time to do that sort of thing, and this is now. So it's much better to deal with this corrosion if you've got it available in your budget, to do it now before all of our painting goes on, and then you're never likely to have to deal with this anytime soon. Well, the good news is stage 1 of the battery box corrosion treatment is okay. That works okay. Removing the bracket nice and delicately, didn't have to leave or apply any force. Once the spot welds were removed, it simply just almost fell off. Literally massive corrosion on this, and I'm quite a confident person in my work, and normally I can remove the corrosion on these battery boxes, but I'll be completely honest, I don't think I'm going to be able to remove that without causing a thin spot or a hole in this battery box. But we will see. I'm just preparing and warning to show you that sometimes things just can't be saved. We will see. Hopefully it will turn out okay, but there are some really deep bits of corrosion here, so I will start work and see what we finish. I've drilled out the spot welds and removed the 2 brake pipe brackets and the 2 fuel pipe brackets. You can see where I've drilled the spot welds to release those brackets, and this is the corrosion behind, which we were unlikely to get. Not a great amount on this side, a little bit over here on this left hand side, but quite a lot on this right hand side. So anything from inside those spot weld drills we are unlikely to be able to remove, or almost definitely not be able to remove correctly or effectively. And a little bit under the brake pipe bracket as well. So that's what it looks like, or the rear axle carrier panel looks like with none of its brackets on. And if we go over to the brackets themselves, I've laid them out next to the new ones, or the refurbished ones, blasted ones, to show the difference. So they don't look too much different, apart from just embedded with corrosion. And like I say, although the outside would have been roughly able to be corroded, remove the corrosion, sorry, or certainly treat it, getting into these areas is extremely hard, so it's just better to do it with a blasting technique, which is what gives us this. And then even once they've been blasted, we then neutralize the corrosion with a POR15 metal prep chemical. So now we can paint the back of them with a weld through primer and start the repair or replacing those once the panel, rear axle carrier panel, has been treated as well. Here's the panel looking a lot more bare, much more bare metal showing now, where we removed the seam sealer and the E-coat. It's certainly on the corroded areas. Remember, this customer, for example, is having our corrosion treatment process, which removes the corrosion on the rear axle carrier panel and local areas, for instance the battery box there. So that's where we are at the moment. Many hours of corrosion removal. We still need to work on the panel in a few areas, like stitch welding down here, removing those broken spot welds and replacing them with plug welds, finding the ends of the cracks on here, and also doing stitch welding inside the car and that there. And this is all before, notice we haven't got any reinforcement plates on yet. This is the prep work stage. We've removed the two brackets, brake pipe bracket, fuel tank bracket and brake pipe bracket. They've been removed so that we can loosen off and remove the corrosion, but you can still see it's here in the grain, and that is going over quite heavy with strong wire knotted wheel attached to a grinder, which is extremely strong without damaging the metal or thinning it out as much. So the next stage would be to thin that with a grind wheel or a flap disc, but that's too risky. So what we have to do is treat this corrosion now to try and stop it or neutralize it. Gone all the way around the handbrake carriers. Obviously we can't get into the internal sections, but those will be cavity waxed once we've finished our paint process. Spring turrets and the perch locations there. Found another 3 spot welds which were looking poor, so I've drilled those out. Still need to weld or plug weld them. Edge of the rear axle carrier panel to the boot panel also suffers with corrosion now and again. This, remember back to the video earlier on, was seriously corroded, this area. And the same with the nipple sections, as you call it. Rear turrets have also been knocked off, as in corrosion, and removed. And more importantly, the battery tray. I don't know how, but it didn't hold, it didn't go through. So we're going to stop there before we risk damaging the panel. Chipped off and brushed off as much loose as we can using small little wire wheels, rotating wire wheels in drills and angle grinders. And now we can move on to the chemical treatment stage with POR15 metal prep.
Here I am brushing on the POR15 metal prep. This needs to stay moist for 30 minutes, and then we'll remove this, wash it off with a moist, warm microfiber cloth.
Here's an example of the POR15 metal prep on the front section. These were the terribly corroded areas of the rear axle carrier panel behind the brackets for the fuel straps that we've taken off. And that's, like I say, got to stay moist for 30 minutes, so effectively the entire rear axle carrier panel we just continually keep going, because by the time you've got to the first stage, which was, for example, the turrets at the top, the last stage is dry, well, not dry, but struggling. So you just keep on brushing and keep on topping it up for 30 minutes. That's the POR15 metal prep treatment carried out, the chemical treatment to neutralize the corrosion and put a zinc phosphate coat on the bare metal now before we can go forward for the next steps. That's had 30 minutes of moisture, and now it's also been wiped off with a clean, damp, warm microfiber cloth. And it's still a little bit damp, but we've done that before we go home for the end of the day, so we can leave this just drying naturally overnight. It doesn't look a great amount different at the moment, but it feels really different, and you just know you've done some good to those corroded areas. And we'll put the infrared lamps on just now for the next sort of 10-15 minutes, Obviously switch them off before we leave the building, but that just helps dry things out if there was any moisture left in any of the cavities. And then we'll return tomorrow and see how it's looking. Well, I'm planning ahead for tomorrow's work, and I've decided I'm going to stay a little bit longer and get some POR15 rust preventative paint on these really corroded areas tonight before I go. Main reason being this takes around about 3 hours to dry, 3 to 4 depending on the temperature and time of year. We're only going to do one coat, and I'm going to put it on the areas that are extremely corroded, like this battery box. The areas that I don't need to basically buff off again, I still need to obviously do the reinforcement plate work, so I'm not going to put anything on those areas, but I'm going to put it on these really nasty, deep, corroded areas. This is where the fuel tank was rubbing. Obviously we want nice bright metal, and I can't put anything on the areas where I need to be welding the brackets back on, but like I say, I'm going to get it on these nasty areas. So I'm going to dry these areas out a little bit more thoroughly, get them on. Here I don't need to take any bare metal again, so I'm going to put it on there as well. Also on the turrets, and the reason being is because when I come in tomorrow I want to get straight on with grinding, welding and working on the reinforcement plates, and I don't want to have sticky paint drying, which is going to get loads of dust in it. So I'm going to do that tonight. When I come in tomorrow, all that paint will be dry and I can go straight onto the reinforcement plate work. So here's the POR15 after it's dried overnight. Extremely strong, needs a nice self-leveling gloss finish. Not that we'll see that because it'll still be coated with a high build primer and sprayable seam sealer and top coat. As you saw in the video earlier, we just painted the areas where we won't be welding anything, so we shouldn't need to rub any of this off, or certainly not as much of it. We've got it in the corroded areas, the extreme corroded areas, like the spring locating perch, the top mount, both sides, spring perch, top mount, the right hand side edge. If you look back to the video, there was loads of corrosion around a stud here. I've removed the stud and I'll shortly drill through this and ready for a riv stud. There was massive corrosion here on a stud, which is removed, ready for a riv stud. General corrosion around a spot weld there. You still see the metal is pitted underneath, that's why I've put some there, and I will need to take some off to get the reinforcement plate welded on, but at least it had some better protection than it did have. A little bit around the edge of the rear axle carrier panel to the boot floor panel. Behind the brackets that we took off, which we're doing on the exchange program, leaving the section of areas where I'll be plug welding. I'm likely to need to take a little bit more off around there, but again, it's just excellent to see this covering the corroded areas. On the edges as well, little bits on the fronts of the handbrake carriers, and especially on the back, loads of deep pitting in the metal grain up here. So you give a nice glossy reflection coming back, and then especially on this area here where the fuel tank was rubbing, you can see how much was in the metal, the peaks and troughs that is, where that's flat, nice smooth metal, that was extremely pitted, and these two lips of the rear axle carrier panel up here. So we've got some over there, left gaps ready to plug weld our new brackets back on. And then more importantly, the battery box, which might not look much on this video, but it's come out extremely well. If you scan back to what it looked like earlier in the video when it had the bracket on and it was just bubbling with corrosion, we've been really lucky and able to get rid of the surface corrosion without making the battery box go through, so to speak. And it's had metal prep, which is makes the bare metal just stay totally perfect and doesn't oxidize or rust any further. And then it's got the rust preventative paint. This is only one coat, but already it's super strong, protecting against any future corrosion or salts and things like that. And more importantly, if you've ever used POR15, I try and use my nail as hard as I can. That's not my thumb, that's my thumb, that's my nail. You can hear me scratching and scratching away at it. And there's absolutely nothing coming off. This is so resilient, POR15 rust preventative paint in black. It is fantastic. You need a screwdriver or something extremely sharp, and you need to press hard to break through this stuff. It is unbelievably strong. So that's the perfect base for protecting those heavily corroded areas. And now we can move on and start the weld through primer on the mounting points where I'm about to put the reinforcement plates. Our mounting points are now fully prepared and double checked with the plates offered up, and we've got a weld through primer on the areas of bare metal where we'll be plug welding the brackets back on and welding the reinforcement plates, plus the spacer plates here, reinforcement plate, brackets, reinforcement plate, and one more reinforcement plate on the left rear. Here's what the left rear mount looks like once we've got the Redish V2 reinforcement plate bolted into position. So that's bolted tight against the floor of the rear axle carrier panel, or the lower section of the rear axle carrier panel. Just checking the fit, looking very good. So we can start tack welding that plate into position before the actual full welding process. The perimeter of the reinforcement plate's welded, and now we're just going to do the plug welds on the inside edge. And now these ones you could just plug straight to the rear axle carrier panel, but we actually drill through the outer layer of rear axle carrier panel. So you might be able to see a step in here, and we're actually exposed the threaded platform inside. So we'll start our plug weld on that threaded platform, then puddle it down towards the rear axle carrier panel that we've just cut out, and then into the Redish V2 reinforcement plate. So one plug weld holds three things together and stabilizes the internal threaded receivers far better. We also do that on the vertical section as well. There's two original spot welds here, and then we go in between those two and cut out a section, very small section, and then we'll start a plug weld on that and then bring it down to fill our channels that are cut into the reinforcement plate. Here's the plug welds on the rear plate that followed on from the video earlier where we showed how we're going to penetrate into the threaded receiver. Now we've just been welding on the brackets, the replacement brackets for the fuel tank and the brake pipe brackets. We've got the front left plate on. We've just drilled the front section of the rear axle carrier panel and got that in weld through primer, just waiting for that to dry, and then we can finish our plug welds underneath. Spacer plates are on. There's the right front plate. Again, just weld through primer into the cavities, waiting for that to dry, then we can finish our plug welds there. Right hand side plate and fuel pipe, brake pipe bracket are on as well, and then we can just finish and go over and start flattening off the welds underneath where the bush is going to contact. I've removed those spot welds on the inside left side lip of the rear axle carrier panel, replaced them for plug welds which have penetrated through into the wheel arch panel, and I've just cleaned and dug out as much of the seam sealer. There's a lot of cavity wax in between these two panels, so these are really hard to weld, especially because it's an edge, it's a thin piece, you haven't got much to penetrate, and there's also corrosion in that metal grain, which is going to make it tricky. Also a little crack in the rear axle carrier panel, just here, and I chased and looked, and luckily it only stopped at the spot weld, it didn't travel any further, so we'll make sure we cover that as well. And now we're going to stitch weld, or pulse weld, this panel, rear axle carrier panel, to the wheel arch panel. From the final spot weld failures on the car, these are some of the spot welds holding the rear axle carrier panel to the chassis legs and seat panel inside the car. This is what we call the inner rectangle. There's a rectangle shaped run of spot welds, and some of them had so many small cracks coming out of them, which you could see in the light at this angle. I decided just to take sections out because I know that there's a platform above it, which is the chassis leg, so I can get much better penetration in an 8mm wide spot weld rather than a 2mm. So I'm just going to do 3 plug welds all in one go, connect them together, and that actually effectively takes away the cracked metal. There's our connection weld to hold the two panels together. Didn't go too bad, quite a struggle with the corrosion in the metal grain there. So we'll come and flap that down, get it nice and smooth, trim the edge off, make it nice and flat so that it's as thick as the old, or actually it's slightly a bit thicker than the old rear axle carrier panel lip, so that when we do our paint protection and sealer, we've got something to actually stick to and bite on this face going up that way. Also done our plug welds, got some nice overhead flat plug welds Can't do that one yet because that's part of the rib and we need to push the rib down because it's too high at the moment. So we'll go inside, do that, and then come back and penetrate our weld into that one. And another nice flat penetrated overhead MIG weld to hold the 3 panels in the corner front section together. So most of the welding's complete in the front section of the rear axle carrier panel in the cavities, and just before I cover them up with our cover plates, I just thought I would show what they look like. So there's the replacement MIG welds, and we've got our through plug weld which is connecting the Redish Motorsport V2 upright plate to the rear axle carrier panel and the cavity skin. Also got the plug welds and the stitch welds down the side of the seat panel. We've got stitch welds on the rear axle carrier panel to the chassis leg. We've got the new MIG welds and the through weld in the internal front cavities. A couple of stitch welds and plug welds for the seat panel, and also the plug welds to repair that crack in the seat panel there, and also stitch welding on the rear axle carrier panel to the chassis leg. So now we can use our cover plates and get those fitted, and then we've got an inspection hole for checking in the future and also cavity waxing now. There's the boot floor front section placed back on, and it fits the line perfectly and touches down on the sides and on the rear axle carrier panel, so that is ready for welding back in place. You can just see the bar underneath that original factory grommet, and because we won't be able to access those grommets and cavity wax in those locations, I've put new ones here, 20mm hole here, 20mm hole here. We'll put the grommets in those locations, but that gives us great entry to be able to cavity wax. So just lined up the boot panel and got that tacked in place. Close the gap. So we've got a near non-existent cut line. It's closed up really nice. So just going to start filling those up, and also the 10 plug welds across the front, 2 MIG welds down the side, and then we will grind and shape our weld line across the middle to try and hide it and disguise it so that when it's painted, hopefully you won't notice we've been there. All the welding work's complete now. We've got the Redish V2 reinforcement plates on and the brake and fuel pipe brackets back in place. Flatten down the plug welds on the bottom and just shape the joint, make it look a bit nicer, and that's where the bushes are going to touch, so they always have to be flat. Got some penetration marks showing that the rear axle carrier panel is now welded to the chassis leg inside the car. Brake and fuel pipe brackets, fuel tank brackets back in their original positions with the gaps correct. Again, more penetration marks. There's the right rear reinforcement plate and the left rear. Up in the corner, 3 plug welds and panel joined together. You can see some of the through plug weld that we did from the inside facing down, showing penetration. So we're just going to panel wipe this. We've dusted already and airline blowed everything and all the crevices. Panel wipe next, and then we can go on to the etch primer onto the bare metal locations. Here's the etch primer drying under the infrared lamps. That's pretty much dry now, so we can move on to the next stage, which is high build primer. We've also finished all the welding and fabrication work inside the car, just vacuumed that out and panel wiped everything, so there's no dust. It's totally ready to get the etch primer next layer on, which is the bare metal stage. So we'll be etch priming all the bare metal joints. So I'm just getting the paint ready. We're going to do a two-tone on this one, so it's going to be an OEM underneath, which is our version of the electrophoretic colouring that the chassis gets at factory when it's dipped, and then we're going to do body colour, Titan Silver in the wheel arches and inside the car. Here's the high build primer, which is a matte black finish. That's applied all over the car, over the POR15, over the etch primer, over the rear axle carrier panel and surrounding areas, right back to the rear panel. Here's what the battery box looks like now. Remember back to the corrosion earlier on in the video. And now very, very limited corrosion on these brackets. Now we've exchanged them for blasted ones, re-welded them. Looking good if we do say so ourselves. No corrosion on the turret anymore, or certainly it's been treated anyway. And now we can go forward and apply the sprayable seam sealer. Here's the inside of the car. Now we've got the high build primer. That's dried, so we're ready to go in with the sprayable seam sealer. The interior is just painted. Just done a top coat of Titan silver. That is just going to be drying now for several hours, but it's come out really well. Really pleased with this. You can hardly see the cut line that was done earlier on because the texture of the seam sealer is just enough to hide any last remnants of weld which didn't go totally flat. So we've done a brush seam stroke down the side panels, stitch welding and across the front of the boot floor there like it was at factory. We haven't painted over here on these parts of the chassis legs. We've just gone to the very tops of these chassis legs, but even with this poor light, it's a very good blend. Really pleased with the texture all the way to the rear panel. So we just need to let that dry now, and then we can come back and start doing the cavity wax through these various holes. I've now finished the E-coat colour underneath the car, and we've kept the wheel arches silver. So you see the definite blend, Titan silver into the natural top line of the wheel arch, compared to the E-coat colouring underneath the rear axle carrier panel. So it's the same on both sides. That's what we would class our two-tone finish or two usage. So it's still drying, but you've got a great texture, but it's thin enough still not to be floppy, and you can see the relevant reinforcement plates and the new brackets or the refurbished brackets that we put on. And then we've got a blend up into the middle of the fuel tank area. Remember how corroded this bit here? If you can't, just look back on the video. This was terrible, this section up here. Same with these handbrake consoles here. Still see some of the stitch welding coming through. Again, that highlights that this car's had some extensive welding work. Here's the right rear. Here's the left rear reinforcement plate. If you're wondering what these holes are, these are our new way to cavity wax the internal box section. This is a separate cavity, so it's nice to have a definite cavity wax going through those sections, and then we grommet them later on. We've gone all the way to the rear panel as well, and really importantly, battery box, battery trays come out really well, nice texture, general blend in. You can still see some of the original seam sealer, but very pleased with that. It's looking very good. We've still got to put a couple of rib studs in, but we tend to wait until this is dry, the sealer and the colour in, because we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 rib studs to put in, and then grommets. But once this is dry, we need to do our cavity waxing, and then we can put grommets in everywhere. The underside seam sealer is dried overnight, and we've just carried out the cavity wax process, which is injecting high creep cavity wax into the box section, hidden cavities in the front and the rear of the rear axle carrier panel. We do that from underneath the car and inside the car through various holes that are already in position, and then some other ones that we've created through knowledge of how to improve the cavity wax delivery into the threaded mounts, for example, behind there. And it starts coming out the fluted areas once it gets to a level that it needs to come out. These are the holes which we're going to be putting rib studs in, but they're also excellent access points to get into some of these hidden cavities. And that's finished dripping now, so we can start putting the grommets in place, knowing that we've got good protection all through the backs of these welded plates areas, and where we've done the welding on the fuel tank brackets and the brake pipe brackets. Here's a look at the inside of the car now the seam sealer and the Titan silver body colour paint is dried, and we've got some cavity wax just trickling out of the front cover plates, which again is fine, we don't mind that, we can clean that up, but that's showing that we're extensively cavity waxing the cars. And we've done brush strokes, seam sealer down the side of the seat panel where we did those plug welds earlier on in the process. And then looking round from the back of the car, again we've got some cavity wax that's just coming out some of the holes, which we'll clean up lightly before we put the bungs back in place. We've got to put a sound deadening pad on, which we're going to do next. We're just starting to put the trims and polystyrene kit and the wiring loom, battery and looms towards the back of the car, but give you a closer look at the line. Might just be able to see the weld line sort of around about there, but we're very happy with that. And if some of you more eagle-eyed viewers notice these brackets, these weld lines over here, thinking that that's a little bit unusual, what's that? That is a internal bar system that we've put in place for this customer, but I couldn't show you the process earlier on behind that cover, what's behind there, because it's still a prototype version, and that's why you see some weld lines just behind those 20mm grommet holes, and why I've done some new 20mm grommets here, because we're not going to be able to use there because there's a bar underneath there. So more on that in another video, it's just too much to discuss all on this video. But this car has got some additional strength via a bar going between the chassis legs underneath that boot floor panel cover. Here's the brand new BMW sound pad, just placed in place on the rear axle carrier panel, ready to start the heat and warm up process and press it into all the contours of the floor. Here it is, now the fuel tank's installed, so we've got the brake pipes fitted up. Just for reference, those aren't our brake pipes, we don't fit copper pipes, these are the ones that the car came with already. We only fit genuine BMW steel brake pipes, so if anybody wonders why those brake pipes are looking a bit weird and got what looked like kinks in them, just review back to the video when we started the project, that was already there and wasn't us. We have installed a new refurbished BMW over axle brake pipe to the factory joint just up there, because this end of the old copper pipe failed, so we had to put a brake pipe in. But notice how we've put the nice BMW shaped correct ones in, cleaned up the blue full vent hose, put new brake pipe clips on all points that we can, new grommets in locations, new oversized washers for the heat shields. They never came with these, they had 18mm, but we put the 30s in to spread the load because they corrode normally. Here's the riv nuts that we've installed because of corrosion. So we've got one here and one here. New black clip, new white clip. Front studs are in and torqued up. Oh yeah, nice to show the brake, the fuel tank. We put the rubber buffing pads in the correct location. We found them, they'd migrated onto the top of the tank, which was allowing the tank to contact the chassis and corrode, but now we've got them in the correct location. That stops the tank rubbing against the paint or the metal chassis, gives it more protection for the future. That is roughly about it. Waiting for the axle to go in at this stage, which won't be long at all. In fact, we're really, to be honest, ready for the axle now, so we can bring it over, lower the car down and get that axle bolted into the rear axle carrier panel. Here's a view from the back of the car looking forward, and we've got the new BMW sound deadening pad pressed on, cut to shape, nice and parallel against the front lip of the boot floor, nice and tight down the chassis legs, overlapping the panel, or the inner rectangle where it contacts with the other parts of the chassis, heated up and pressed down into position. A few more things of the interior going back into place. Let's go and have a look from the other side. Looking nice, parallel line against the other sound deadening pad where it joins, just overlaps the top of our cover plates and just leaves enough of a gap for our holes here, which are cavity wax holes, and also for us to insert the grommets. and it just overlaps onto the seat panel edge where we've done some of the welding as well. So just going to have a dust around inside, one final vacuum, and then we can start fitting up the sound insulation on the wheel arch panels, then the door cards, getting the wiring double checked, and the big grommets, the foam grommets for the wire and loom into the rear bulkhead. So I'm in the back of the car just putting the trims back together, just put the sound deadening pads on the wheel arch panel, just put the door cards back on. Just thought it'd be interesting to show in the light. These are the seats which are double bag protected, and the doors are protected always. Door cards aren't even in position, and neither is the the glass is all protected. Still need to put that trim down there. But just wanted to see if you can see on the camera the amount of dust and general paint overspray that lands and contacts and just naturally wants to fall about. It's not much, but imagine if that wasn't protected, then leathers and things like that would also have all that over it. So we go to great lengths to try and keep all this away from the car's interior, so when we remove all this and uncover the doors and refit the trims that weren't fitted earlier on, everything still looks as fresh as when the car came in. So we've put the axle back into place and bolted that in. We've got new genuine BMW rubber subframe bushes, 2 for the rear, 2 for the front. We've also got trailing arm bushes, which are the Powerflex polyurethane brand. We've got some Hell braided hoses. Also put new brackets and slide clips on both sides. We've also got new ball joints in the trailing arm at the bottom, as these were seized. So we've got new camber bolts, BMW genuine camber bolts, also with the new arms as well, so that gets a pair of new bushes in that joint inside there. Next we're going to be connecting the brake lines up and then putting the springs in and shock absorbers. So the rebuild is coming along. Thought it'd be interesting to have a look in the cavity. Here's the inspection hole, which we'll bung later on, but we're looking for pretty much everything covered in wax. Nice sort of golden brown colour, which is the wax. Look on the other side as well. It's that all round the welds, which is going to be protecting it very nicely. Here's looking into the boot cavity where the panel edge was, where we did some plug welds earlier on. You can just see one of the plug welds in the distance, nicely swimming in cavity wax, which has just been applied again. So that's a second pass, what we call a top up, and that will carry on creeping for a little bit and then it will stop. There's another area to look at. So all the areas where we've done welding are nicely protected. Here's one of the last shots of the rear axle carrier panel uncovered before we put the final carpet on and start putting the seats in place and the side bolsters, but that just gives you an example of the attention to detail. In theory, if you didn't really know an E46, you'd probably open this car up if you ever had to go in there, and you wouldn't necessarily know we've been in here or it's had as extensive work as you've just watched on this video. And if you ever want to check internal cavities on the front again, all you need to do is just take the rear seats out, the backrest and the bench, and then just look for these rectangle sections where we removed the bracket earlier. There's a black grommet in there, just prise out the grommet, and then you'll be able to look inside either with your phone camera or a borescope camera. You check on the cavity wax, you could top it up, and you can also check the welds inside as well. I'm also going to take the liberty to change a bolster securing clip. This one we found broken, and we keep these things in stock. This is the new one. The latch is broken, but that's not surprising because there's a tracker behind this side door card, and we found that interesting wiring up there. So somebody's been on this side before. We'll just swap that clip out so you don't get any trim rattles. We've now connected the Hell braided lines, which are stainless steel fittings, to the BMW metal pipes with new spring clips, and we've coated them with a wax coat all around the hex union and on the brake pipe. And there's an example there on that fitting as well, so they'll be fully protected from the elements going forward for future years.
So rear shock absorbers are installed and the top mounts. We removed that corrosion earlier on in the process. Put a little bit of transparent wax now on the top mount area where it did have corrosion on. Attached all the fuel vapor lines for the expansion tank, all with genuine BMW OEM clipping points, one there, one there, one there, so it doesn't really look like it's ever been off. No Jubilee clips, no cable ties, it's all original equipment. Now we're coming towards the end of the process. We need to carry out a brake fluid bleed, so we'll do a brake fluid change and full system bleed through all 4 brake calipers, and all the nipples are looking extremely corroded, so we're going to replace all 4 brake nipples with genuine BMW items. So we've carried out the brake fluid bleed on most of the car and just found a leak, and this is one of those lessons to remind yourself that you should trust your judgment sometimes, and that terribly executed sharp brake pipe from whoever last did those is leaking quite a lot, so it means that that's going to have to be remade, a little bit like what we did on the other side, and we put a nice BMW one on there. We're now going to have to do the same, and this is just a little example to prove that nothing's manufactured. These videos are as it is, and we've got a leak and we've got to change that pipe now. So sometimes when you see cars come in with copper brake pipes, it's the exact reason why we strongly suggest they get changed, because 9 times out of 10 they're so brittle, the flares are poor, and they give more trouble than they're worth. Here is the offending article. Here's an example of the one we're going to put on. Genuine BMW steel hoses that have got some sort of plastic coating on them. Already come with unions, correctly flared, ready to go. They come straight, but we've got the BMW special tool to bend them without kinking. I've just put that bend in it, which is one of the ones that's going to replace that copper one that we've just found leaking. Here's the replacement brake pipe we had to make up. We used genuine BMW steel pipe, which has got a plastic coat, and we've connected that to the flexi line. Unfortunately, because it was all in position, we have managed to get a bit of dirt, which we can't get off, but that's the small price we pay for having a failed item like those really poor copper lines that fractured. So now we can coat that with a wax to make sure it's all protected and the union won't corrode again, and it'll be able to be undone hopefully in 10 years' time, I'm sure. Here's the very final view of the boot floor. Now we're just about to put the last carpets in. It's come out very nice and bright, Titan silver, all the bungs or grommets fitted, and full cavity waxing inside those areas. And remember, before we did a massive cut through there, re-welded back on. You just see a little bit of the line over there, but all in all, really pleased with that. Nice factory finish. We finished the rebuild process on this E46 M3. Everything is fitted, torque checked, and more than likely paint marked. We'll just go through the list of items that we've done. So it's had the Redish Motorsport rear axle carrier panel repair and reinforcement process to the underside of the panel, which is traditionally the reinforcement plate work plus the spot weld and crack identification and repair on the video you've been watching earlier on. 4 reinforcement plates, and then there's also the internal work that was carried out inside the car. That's been carried out. We've done an extensive corrosion treatment process with POR15 chemicals. Also a general paint blend out into the wheel arches up past the turrets to the top of the wheel arch. Extensive cavity wax process, and we tend to leave those rear ones on there to give an indication that there is a lot of cavity wax in there, protecting the car nicely. That's also how the factory do it. A lot of cars don't really notice it because it's all dirty nowadays after 15 years worth of road grime, but if you look at one closely you will see wax dribbles out of these flutes, so we tried to replicate how it came out of the factory. We've also carried out the paint process inside the car, which is what you've been looking at earlier on. We replaced a lot of fixings where possible. These are the top hats. We've replaced various clips, grommets that were incorrect or in the wrong location. As well as that, we've had the genuine BMW subframe rubber bushes, 4 of those, trailing arm Powerflex bushes, Hell braided brake lines,
a metal over axle brake line. Also had to have a left brake line, you'll be pleased to hear, to replace that horribly kinked copper one that was supplying this flexi hose. So a new BMW one down into the join where the old copper one was joined underneath the car. They've all been waxed and protected. We've also replaced the anti-roll bar, rear anti-roll bar drop links because the rubber bushes were cracking. Lower arms, which we call the camber arms, but these are the lower arms, along with new ball joints and the BMW eccentric bolts and the washers and the nuts. And that is a ceramic grease. These are extremely common to corrode and seize up, and although it looks a bit greasy and you wonder why, we want these to be fully adjustable in years to come. So we coat them with that, and that should stop the problem or corrosion setting in. General fixings replaced as we've gone. We also had to take the steering tie rods off of the car because they were seized together, and then we've warmed the female side up, separated them. We haven't just painted over those threads, we've taken the male part out of the female completely, protected inside that female thread and the male thread, and then joined them back together, fitted new nylock BMW nuts on both sides so that they're adjustable for the for the wheel alignment process next. Hell braided front lines as well. Put a few fixings. It did have the incorrect bolts, but we put some copper nuts because the old nuts didn't have any flange on them, so we put some nuts on there. A few little bits of wax. We waxed the plate on the centre and a few other items just to try and slow down or make it not look so in your face, the surface corrosion that is on the diff and the subframe itself. That is roughly about it. As an example of the new fixing, put the larger heat shield washers on there. So we carried out a brake fluid bleed. We've also changed all 4 brake bleed nipples because they were rounded, they were less than a 9mm hex, and the front left one was so seized in it had to be warmed up and tapped and used mole grips to get out. So we've replaced all of those. There's the battery box. Now we've removed all that nasty corrosion and the bracket, treated it, painted it, sealed it and top coated it. We've also put copper nuts on the rear exhaust rubber mounts. The customer had already had the rubber mounts replaced. We've just put the new BMW copper nuts on there and coated them with wax so that they should come undone in years to come. So now we can get the wheel alignment process carried out. Time to carry out the exit clean or the wash. So we've done a snow foam wash, cleaned the wheels, jet washed the snow foam off, and now we've got Iron X on there, just seeing if there's any atmospheric fallout, a little bit of red on that left front wing. Now once that's been on there for about 4 or 5 minutes, we can jet wash that off. Thus the rear axle carrier panel repair and reinforcement process complete on this E46 M3. Carried out full brake fluid bleed, 12-mile road test and digital wheel alignment. The car's had a clean and exit wash here in house, and now that's ready to hand over to the customer.